the most interesting dynamic to me still, years later, is ways in which the internet has enabled networked activism, but more than that, also just kind of persistent crowd dynamics. And what that crowd is pointed at and who points the crowd at something is a thing that I'm very, very interested in, because I think that gets to the real question, the underlying question of power, right? And what do you put all of these people's attention, all of these people's energy and effort, what do you point it at?
Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio, where we keep you up to date on the latest technological trends and how they're impacting the transformation of consciousness and culture, from the individual to society at large. This week, our guest is Renee Diresta, the Technical Research Manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary team that explores the abuses of our current information technologies. Specifically, Renee investigates the spread of narratives and propaganda across social networks such as pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorist activity, and state-sponsored information warfare. We focused heavily on these topics during our conversation, exploring everything from how Renee's interest was first piqued by the anti-vaxxer community, how Redditors impacted the stock market with Gamestop, Russia's involvement in the 2016 American presidential election, and the potential benefits and consequences of certified digital IDs. Luckily, Renee's abundance of knowledge in these areas make for a well-articulated and comprehensive journey. As usual, you can check the episode description for details on how to connect to more of Renee's work. And you can also find in the episode description the link to su.org/podcast, where you can explore your options for joining our community of over 30,000 entrepreneurs, technologists, creatives, and changemakers of all kinds. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. Everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Renee Diresta. Well, I thought to start, one of the best things to do might be to get a little bit of background on you and your work, and probably specifically wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Stanford Internet Observatory and what you do there studying the abuse of information technologies.
Sure. So my background, I went to school for computer science and political science, so long ago now, and I graduated. I went to Wall Street, actually, was my first real job kind of out of college, and I was a derivatives trader. And so I did that for a while, and then ultimately I got bored in 2011, and I just felt like I had been through the financial crisis, I'd been through the European debt crisis. I felt like I had seen all of the types of wild, exciting crashes that the market was, the one person needed to be there for in a lifetime. And so I decided I was going to kind of go back into tech. But by this point, I wasn't as useful as an engineer. And so I came out to the Valley as in venture capital. I took a VC job, and I worked with Tim O'Reilly and the firm O'Reilly Alpha Tech Ventures. Bryce Roberts was there at the time. And we did a lot of investing in startups that one of the underlying missions had to be that it had to be doing something good for the world. So it was really interesting to come to the Valley, but also come to the Valley in this environment that was very focused on doing good and thinking big. And actually, I went to Singularity University a couple times for demo day. This is why this is sort of on my mind. And we were always really interested in finding things that moved the needle in solving societal problems using tech, as opposed to here's yet another ad-based social network. And the experience was really remarkable. Again, it was a great way to meet people in the Valley and to understand the networks, the dynamics, the culture, the blind spots also. And I felt like, so I did that for about 3 years and then left to start a company in supply chain logistics. And I felt that there needed to be some rethinking of how goods moved around the world. I felt like that was sort of an inefficient process. And so I started a supply chain logistics company focused on container shipping. Meanwhile, as I was doing this, I had my first baby, and I got very interested in the anti-vaccine movement online. And and as a pro-vaccine parent, to be clear, but I was very interested in all of a sudden, I felt like I was being barraged with social media posts about anti-vaccine stuff, and I felt that that was, bad actually. And so I started kind of digging around the way that online network dynamics around anti-vaxxers were taking shape, and that was kind of what started as like my night project, my sort of, everyone in the Valley has like a side hustle, right? That was mine. And so my side project, my side interest in just like using data science and data visualization, which I was kind of, teaching myself more and more of, was really where my interest increasingly started to lie. And what wound up happening was that I started doing work to try to understand the dynamics of anti-vaccine misinformation online across platforms. And that became sort of more and more of a passion area for me. And what took me to the Stanford Internet Observatory was I kept doing that work at night. And then it was at a time in 2015 when I think other people were beginning to realize that the same dynamics that kind of conspiratorial groups were using to grow their members online, to grow their numbers, were also being used by really bad groups like terrorist organizations. And so ISIS was operating at the time. And I got this very unexpected phone call asking if I would participate in doing similar research, similar, like, how do we understand the network dynamics of these messages? How do we understand how these messages spread, related to ISIS? And so all of it, I was like, well, I'm not a counterterrorism expert by any stretch. And they were like, that's not the point. So I spent some time with a few other folks at State Department looking at this question. And then I started to feel, as sometimes happens, that my side stuff was becoming more and more my primary area of interest. And so that was, kind of a long-winded way of saying eventually I just kind of wanted to do this full time. So I went first to a company that was doing it, called Yonder, and then I went to Stanford Internet Observatory when all of a sudden there was funding and academic interest, and sort of 4 years after I had started feeling like something was kind of off, there was now a center that we could build and dedicate to studying it. So at SIO, we work not only on understanding mis and disinformation, that's part of it, but the framing, the abuse of current information technology has really come to mean a lot of different things. And so some of what we try to understand is the dynamic of, what happens to the world when end-to-end encryption becomes prevalent, what happens to the world when generative AI produces videos and images and text, what happens to how do we think about protecting the rights of individuals, the rights of children, the rights of people who live outside of areas that Silicon Valley focuses on, in whether that be with privacy protecting technologies or ways in which social media has a negative impact on their political environment or ecosystem, ways in which exploitation occurs. So that's been in a nutshell, I think. We try to focus the center not only on mis and disinformation, though that is a very big part of it, but also on these other information technologies, thinking again about the internet ecosystem as a holistic system. And much like the old work on Wall Street, ways in which different technologies temporarily shift or create problems in the information space, and then how this all kind of fits together holistically.
I feel like you're alluding to GameStop there a little bit.
I watched that was really fascinating to me on so many different levels. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about GameStop. I can definitely.
Yeah, I mean, we can take a quick segue because actually that might be an interesting point, because that is something that was almost in a way conspiratorial, was this mass of people on an internet forum rallying together to create a real world change. I mean, what was your take on that?
I thought it was fascinating. I mean, first there was I think that the most interesting dynamic to me still, years later, is ways in which the internet has enabled networked activism, but more than that, also just kind of persistent crowd dynamics. And what that crowd is pointed at and who points the crowd at something is a thing that I'm very, very interested in, because I think that gets to the real question, the underlying question of power, right? And what do you put all of these people's attention, all of these people's energy and effort, what do you point it at? And so seeing it pointed at Wall Street, I remember Occupy. It was in the park adjacent to my office when I worked on Wall Street, actually. And I remember thinking that there was a lot of energy, and and they were right about certain things, but there was no guidance, there was no momentum, there was no ask, there was nothing, there was anger, but that was it. And anger is justifiable and can be used to galvanize movements, but it was this sort of it
They
was very
were they were
rudderless.
aimless. Yeah,
They were
it's like
very aimless. Yeah. And so what I thought was really interesting about watching this dynamic was the opportunity for certain influential voices to kind of rise to the top in the community, and to to some extent democratically, but also we have to be real about you never know who's in the internet crowd, right? That's one of the interesting dynamics. And I was reading these early tweets and articles about thinking about it as like this populist anti-Wall Street revolution, as like fighting against the traders. And I was like, when I was a trader, we read Reddit. Like, what are you talking about? Like people on Wall Street don't know that Reddit exists. What is this nonsense? Matt Levine, I think, was the one who did the best coverage of like articulating how ridiculous that particular aspect of it was. Um, but I think, again, it does show the ways in which um, bottom-up networked activism can have a real transformative effect today uh, on power structures. And I think that the thing that I'm also very interested in seeing is the extent to which Wall Street, which actually has functional regulators, comes back and does something about it. I'm really interested to see what their response to that is going to be, whether they're going to amend their definitions for what manipulative behavior is, how they're going to think about these dynamics going forward, to what extent they're going to try to get in there and figure out who some of those accounts might have been, because some of them were certainly other finance professionals as well. This was not just a plucky band of outsiders, despite the characterization. And then the other piece that I thought was really interesting was the immediate devolution into conspiracy when Robinhood had to halt trading in some of the names, like the assumption that like the man had somehow gotten to them, as opposed to an understanding that margin calls are a thing, and and brokerages have to have a certain amount of capital on hand and such. And so um, the willingness to read conspiracy into everything, I think,
hmm
is one of the real problems in the information ecosystem today, and it was reflected in this particular instance as well.
Yeah, I absolutely loved how you framed that in terms of aiming the masses, or weaponizing the crowd, so to say. Um, and specifically for you, that is done by, or you explore how that's done by misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, fake news. Could you maybe define those terms for us in ways that people might misunderstand them? Because I think that's one of the ways that this gets muddied, is that people really don't know what is the difference between somebody who just posts something that they don't quite understand versus somebody who's actively manipulating people.
Yeah, so misinformation, academically, we use it to mean information that is inadvertently spread and wrong. Or false and misleading information, but that is spread inadvertently. So the person who is sharing it doesn't know, or sorry, the person who's sharing it believes it, and they're doing it out of a sense of altruism. So there's no underlying intent to deceive inherent in sharing misinformation. It's just something that's wrong, and I believe it, and so I share it with you because I want you to be aware of the thing in the article. And there's no nefarious bad guy behind the scenes involved in this interaction. Disinformation involves, in it really, the differentiator is intent. There is an intent to deceive, an intent to influence in a certain way, an intent to achieve some sort of objective, political or economic. And so the information is seeded by a person who knows that what they're spreading is false, knows what they're spreading is manipulative, but again is doing it out of a particular with a particular goal in mind. Propaganda I use to mean information with an agenda. I think it's actually a very it is a broad term. It's The history of propaganda is absolutely fascinating. The term itself dates back to the Catholic Church fighting the Protestant Reformation. It's the Committee for the Propagation of the Faith, and the the idea is that you have to convey the information to the people. You have to propagate the, of course, correct ideas. And it was not always seen as a pejorative, interestingly. It wasn't really seen as a pejorative until around World War II. So there's this whole vast history where the sort of very respectable figures in media and government speak quite openly, particularly in the early 1920s, about how it is actually the responsibility of government to properly inform the people, to align them around policy. And this is where because otherwise society is ungovernable. And so there's this really fascinating literature. If you go back into it, it reads as very, very shocking today, but they're articulating this idea that people have better things to do with their time than become experts in all of the different policy areas that are going to impact them. Ergo, it is the responsibility of government institutions and the media to convey to them the things that they need to know. And we read that today as very much, they're telling us lies. This is manufactured consent. This is propaganda is a way that powerful entities that control communication ecosystems abuse us or mislead or manipulate us. But if you go back and read the early literature on it, it was framed so distinctly differently. And some of the work that I've been doing is trying to understand how do we contextualize disinformation campaigns today in the context of the way that propaganda operations, both what we call white propaganda, attributed or overt propaganda, and then there's a spectrum, white, gray, black, the sort of darker sides of the spectrum where it becomes harder to tell who the message is coming from. And at the sort of darkest phase, the message is actively misattributed to somebody else. So there's this spectrum of different types of propaganda operations that can be carried out. And how do we read what's happening on the internet today in the context of these historical dynamics? Because propaganda didn't just come out of nowhere with the creation of Facebook. And so I think some of the work that we do at SIO is understand the ways in which propaganda has been democratized, meaning that anyone can do this now, per the point about steering the crowd. You don't have to be a ruler. You don't have to be a person who controls a major media channel. It is much, much, much more democratized and much more participatory, meaning ordinary people are very much involved in the sharing process and the spreading process. And so as that evolution has happened, it's interesting to even, the technological manifestation is the evolution. The propaganda is very old. So how does this very old phenomenon modernize in the age of new communication patterns and affordances? And that's one of the things that I spend a lot of time looking at.
Well, and it feels, as I'm hearing you say that, I'm thinking in a sense that propaganda really just feels like everybody having an opinion and just wanting to share it, right? It's hard in a way, I feel like, to separate the fact that all of us are kind of always using language to manipulate people to our point of view or perspective in some sense. It feels like a pretty natural way that we interact. That's kind of our goal. So it
Well, it's interesting you even say manipulate, because one of the things that it's tied to very early on, again, even back in the 1920s, is persuasion and public relations, right? It's the idea that you should persuasively convey your point of view to sway people over to your particular side of a political issue, or make them love your brand. There's a lot of different ways in which it manifests. Advertising, and so this there is this very obviously manipulative angle to it when it's done through these gray and black sort of covert, actively misattributed means. That's where someone is actively manipulating you. But there is then also this idea of propaganda, what the quote unquote white propaganda, which is overt communications from state media, for example, which has another name in academic literature, and that is public diplomacy, right? So the state is conveying its point of view to you, and the state has a point of view, and here it is putting it out there, and it's attributed to the state. And so the question then becomes, how do we process that dynamic again in the broader information ecosystem of the day, where there's so much information coming at you constantly that to some extent what matters is how that information is curated for you. It's not even, are you seeing propaganda? It's what is the makeup of the information hitting you? How are people targeting you with their messages, with their information, either organically or through paid communications? And again, then in aggregate, what is the effect that this has on the individual, but then also on society?
So that is maybe a perfect chance then to talk about how that invitation to explore terrorism matched up with the work you were doing at SIO, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about specific data you were exploring around the Russian involvement in our democracy, and maybe how that related to the terrorism tactics and how this really played out in your personal work.
Yeah, so in 2015, October 2015 was when we were looking at these ISIS dynamics. And again, I was not the terrorism expert on the team. I was there mostly because, again, the ways in which groups began to use the affordances, by affordances I mean the technology that is produced for another purpose entirely, but when a tool is created, it can be turned into a weapon, just as a really simple example, right? Depending on how it's used. And so the fact that you could run an automated account on Twitter meant that lots of artists and really interesting people, news feeds, there was, remember the Big Ben Twitter account that used to like bong on the hour and stuff, just these little kind of whimsical creations. That was like the nice side of Twitter automation. And then the bad side of Twitter automation was terrorist organizations realizing that they could completely own trending topics and various hashtags, really dominate what's called share of voice by running automated accounts. So here again, we had this affordance where we could run automated communication tools. And at the time, Twitter didn't really differentiate between an automated account and a human account in determining what inputs went into deciding that something was trending. And so trending was just constantly being manipulated by whoever ran the bigger botnet, which has really interesting implications if you think of it as like trending is supposed to signal to the public that a lot of people care about a thing, and instead what it's signaling is that the one guy with the biggest bot army cares about a thing, right? So you have these interesting questions around like disproportionate reach of someone's speech, if you will, right? This idea that with the right botnet, you can kind of commandeer the conversation. So as ISIS was doing that, and as they were using what we can point to in history, the agents of influence, the idea that you're engaging with somebody who's operating on behalf of something else, but isn't necessarily disclosing to you who they're operating on behalf of. So with ISIS, because they were trying to legitimize themselves as a as a nation, if you will, like the virtual caliphate, and then the real land that they were working to control, what you started to see was their propaganda was very much about establishing themselves as a viable entity. They were extremely overt. The black flag was everywhere. They had an iconography, they had a language, they had memes. And so they were using the affordances of the social ecosystem to almost will themselves into being as this as a more cohesive, larger organization than they actually were. When we were doing that research, though, one of the interesting things is we were trying to map the contours and understand what that entity was doing. One of the things that was happening was that we already knew that Russia was operating on social platforms. Adrian Chen had written this excellent article that I highly recommend called The Agency. And it was the story of the Internet Research Agency, and he becomes a character in the story. It's an absolutely fantastic read. And so the trolls from Olgano, the Russian troll farm, already existed, and anyone who was paying attention to manipulation on the internet knew about it. And that includes, of course, the US government. So as we're having these conversations about ISIS, um, entities within USG, within Defense Department and DARPA and others, have already realized that that Russia is operating on US social platforms in this covert, manipulative way as well, creating personas that look like Americans. So this is a little bit different than what ISIS chose to do with its affordances, but it's the exact same ecosystem, it's the exact same tools, it's just that they're using it in a slightly different way. So instead of overtly putting themselves out there as we are going to try to persuade you to our point of view by identifying who we are. Instead, what you start to see is, again, using those same tools, the ability to create a persona, the ability to use automation, the ability to reach directly to people, to infiltrate the groups and communities that they participate in, and to serve as agents of influence in this way that is very, very difficult to detect, it's happening at the same time. The IRA is operating at the same time as ISIS, and so you just see it inflected slightly differently. The challenge was there was a belief that there needed to be sort of a center within U.S. government that was going to be responsible for this, right? And what came out of it was this entity at the State Department called the Global Engagement Center. Um, and it's called the Global Engagement Center because it had to engage globally, because the recognition was that US government could not counter propagandize to people who wouldn't, nobody gives a damn if US government tweets at them, don't go join ISIS. Like, who cares, right? Nobody actually motivated to join ISIS cares what the US government State Department Twitter account thinks. So the question became, are there ways for us as a international body to address this organization that was spreading internationally by trying to connect with and amplify the voices of people who could authentically counter that propaganda by giving the people who are receptive to it another message, another way forward, another way to live. And so it was really more about finding those other organizations, those other partner organizations to serve as counters, and then lifting up their message and helping them better reach the public. Because again, this was now a competition for attention. Whose messages were going to be heard? Whose botnet on Twitter was going to get seen? While that conversation about what do we do about this was happening, though, the the thing we kept emphasizing, those of us who were more in the weeds technically, was that this was a system problem and that you were not going to solve it by wiping out one adversary, because what was confronting us was that the tool of social networks, the magic of human connection was being co-opted and manipulated by people who wanted to use it for very deceptive and bad aims. And so you couldn't design a counter approach that focused on the one adversary of the day. You had to think bigger. You had to think about how might this system be restored to how might the system be changed to diminish the bad while keeping the good. And so this was this was a really hard question, because we're saying, look, if ISIS can do this, like, we know Russia is doing it. You better believe any nation state with is going to find this to be a phenomenally effective tool, and they're all going to get in on it. And then, since it's so easy to do, my little anti-vaxxer, friends running their botnets, you better believe every domestic faction in America is going to get in on this too. And then it happened, right? And so now what you've seen is, I think, over the last few years, the rethinking of the space, not only focused on foreign adversaries, state actors and terrorist organizations, but also this recognition that it is democratized. Propaganda is democratized. And what does that mean for us as a society going forward? When there is this kind of constant barrage of messaging and various tactics to try to commandeer attention, and that's the information environment and social ecosystem that we're all living in.
I think you mentioned at one point that when you were trying to create an ad for vaccination to kind of counteract the anti-vaxxers, that you were actually unable to find a way to target that demographic, that it didn't actually exist. So in a way, you're being forced to you were kind of prevented, I guess, from engaging in the most trending conversation. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a really interesting reason for that. So Facebook's ad tool, which is, it's very powerful if you're a small advocacy organization and you need to reach audiences and grow a social movement. I mean, and it is, and new emerging political candidates also, it's incredibly powerful. And you can do very granular targeting. And so what we were trying to do, me as an activist in 2015 in California, we wanted to find pro-vaccine parents to galvanize this counter movement, because you can only do so much by resetting the technical playing field. You do also have to address the substance of the conversation. And so we thought, okay, we're going to grow a parent-led pro-vaccine counter movement. So I was like, okay, so I was paying for my own ads, so there was no pharma shilling or whatever the hell they always accuse you of that. But I was like, okay, so I have about $2,000 to donate to this, to like dedicate to my cause here. So I'm going to run my ads, and so I'm going through the ad tool, and I was like, interestingly, the only targeting remotely related to vaccines was all anti-vaccine targeting. And I couldn't figure out why would Facebook be making it so easy to reach anti-vaxxers. But the anti-vaxxers were doing this. They were running ads. I was getting, I was seeing their ads constantly. I was being targeted because I had indicated an interest in the vaccine conversation. On the other side, but whatever, I kept getting these anti-vaccine ads served to me. And what the realization was that there were certain categories like vaccines that were in there. But then there were these random small niche pages, like you could target ads to fans of Sherry Tenpenny, who's this kind of anti-vaccine quack doctor. And I was like, why is that in here? Who the hell cares? And it was because at the time, this was before ProPublica was actually the one that figured out why this was happening from the outside. The ad tool would key off of if a sufficient number of people entered a certain word in their interests or bios. The ad tool was just kind of pulling from that, and after it hit a certain threshold, it would serve that interest up as an option in the ad tool. Now, ProPublica was looking at this in the context of like phenomenally racist and anti-Semitic terms, right? That people on Facebook who held those views were listing that as like their occupation, like ex-hater. There was some really gross stuff. And that was making its way into the ad tool because the ad tool was just pulling when a sufficient number of people had indicated this interest. It became an interest. And so this was where, again, the problem was the fact that there was so much highly active anti-vaccine activism meant that no pro-vaccine person who vaccinates their kids and goes on with their day is writing like pro-vaxxer in their Facebook bio. That's just it's not a thing that you do, right? And most people, this is like flat earth was my other example of this, where it's like nobody is like defining themselves as a round earther in their Facebook bio. And so there were these certain kind of niche pseudoscience-y areas where people who were very passionate about them, like that was their thing, made it their identity on Facebook, and Facebook responded by keying off of that and turning this into a thing where you could actually target that identity with an ad. So that was how that was happening. And they, after this ProPublica article came out, most of those categories went away. But there was really no good way to run a pro-science advocacy campaign short of ad targeting doctors and public health professionals, getting them involved, and then having them reach out to their personal networks. And I was very disappointed in that state of affairs.
Were there other aspects of the system, like inherent ways that social media platforms, especially, were built that made them susceptible to these forms of misinformation, disinformation that kind of enabled a lot of this behavior?
Again, the recommendation engine was the second biggest thing. So there was, or maybe the biggest organic thing by far. And this was if you followed an account, it would recommend more accounts to you. And sometimes on Facebook, that took the form of groups. On Twitter, that took the form of people. And interestingly, this was happening with the ISIS accounts too. There were just so many similarities in how the technology didn't understand what it was recommending, right? It was just supposed to show you something where if you had this interest, and just for the audience, there's content-based filtering where it says you have this interest, so here's more of the things related to that interest. So you follow an account in a particular topic area, it shows you other accounts in that topic area. This is how kind of the ISIS, dynamics were taking shape. What was happening with the anti-vaxxers and the recommendation engine on Facebook was this idea of collaborative filtering, which is you have an interest and people who are statistically similar to you, they have some degree of similar interests or location or actions, or they read the same things. There's this cloud of data points, and they can assemble some similarity measure in which they say that you are like this person. And so even if you have never searched for anti-vaccine, your interests are similar enough. For me, I was a new parent. I joined a couple parenting groups, and I made my own baby food. I did some things that were a little on the crunchier side of parenting. And so since I was flagged as like crunchy parent, by the Facebook AI, it decided that naturally as a crunchy parent, I probably was interested in anti-vaccine content. And that's not a bad guess, unfortunately, right? And so if you have an algorithm and it is optimized to show the most relevant, salient thing, again, with no ethical sense of what that thing may be, then that similarity measure is correct. And it's inconvenient, but it's correct. And so there were indications that maybe we didn't need to be proactively pushing this stuff to people. And saying that in 2018 was like a very like, whoa, who are we to decide the slope is so slippery, and I remembered hearing the slope is so slippery when we were having the conversation about what to do about the ISIS Twitter accounts in 2015. Because then there was this whole like, well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And if we take down ISIS, what next? And if you say that today, it sounds just crazy, that was where the conversation was in 2015, but it very much was. And it is because the platforms were growing larger and more powerful. And today, I think we've all recognized the impact of that power and the difficulty in moderating on platforms that are that big, because there is the possibility of bad moderation decisions. There is the possibility of deplatforming, and people have come to think of this as the new public square, instead of just an app on their phone that they, pull out when they're bored. And so in a very relatively short period of time, the ecosystem really exploded, and now we're trying to kind of come up with norms and to some extent regulation and guardrails after the fact. And it's very difficult to do that when there's been when people have come to expect that things work a certain way and that these affordances provide a certain degree of reach and algorithmic suggestion and curation of a certain type.
How much has changed in the past 6 years or so? Have you seen much in terms of how the suggestions work or how the algorithms work or any kind of policies?
Yeah, so in 2019, the anti-vaxxers came out of the recommendation engine, and that was because of a couple of very high-profile measles outbreaks, including one in which about 70 kids died. So there was
Mm.
kind of finally a recognition that um, that this was having significant harms. And so the definition of harm was what changed, really. So it used to be that harm referred to immediate incitement to violence, right? And that the kind of content that would come down was content that was advocating an immediate harm. And the platforms began to change their view of what constituted a harm in that period of time. So there were some things with health, right? And with health, that was, again, the vaccines, cancer quackery, things where if you served that content up to people, they would potentially be harmed by it on a personal level, and then public health at a societal level. Interestingly, Google search had already had that designation, already had that recognition that harm could mean other things besides imminent incitement to violence. Google search came up with this framework called Your Money or Your Life. I think it was around 2013, maybe. It was actually pretty old, in that they recognized that if search results, you get a new cancer diagnosis and you type in your cancer and then it serves you a juice fast, website, probably that is not going to be very beneficial for your health. And so Your Money or Your Life was this recognition that there was a certain sort of duty of care, if you will, or a certain quality that they had to return for that information, because people were searching for information to make potentially life or death, or very, very, on a financial sense, meaningful, weighty decisions, and they needed to have good information. That didn't translate to the social platforms
Mm.
because we were never supposed to use them to answer all of life's questions. They were supposed to be places where you like connected with your friends, shared wedding pictures, and like talked about cat memes, right? They weren't supposed to be like where you went when you needed information about your new cancer diagnosis. But then as groups and communities formed on there that were focused on those things, all of a sudden people were searching for that stuff, and then the platforms had to again try to think through what does it mean to potentially harm a community when they're searching for these words, and they're finding searching for MMR as a new parent, and they get a litany of anti-vaccine groups instead of qualified medical professionals. So that was where you started to see this idea that maybe, again, the determination that was made was we're going to remove them from recommendation engines, but they're going to be allowed to remain on the platform. And that was where they initially went with QAnon too. So it's hard to, there are certain bright line areas, and then there are these areas that are not quite so bright. And that's where the public conversation is very much around, are people being unfairly penalized for holding certain beliefs? And that, I think, is the real challenging, dicey question that faces us now. In some ways, we've addressed a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So the policies related to Russian trolls, just again, going back to the quaint old days of Russian trolls. I mean, they're still there. It's just they're not as impactful now as they were before, but that's largely because their infrastructure was dismantled. And now Facebook has integrity teams that go looking for them. And the investigations teams are looking for these networks of fake accounts, and they come down not because of what they say, right? The messaging, oftentimes they'll just grab messaging from some random hyper-partisan political site, but they come down because they're inauthentic, they're fake, and that's a violation of Facebook's terms of service. So we have a whole policy now related to how to handle these networks of fake foreign accounts that were a kind of significant challenge in 2016, but now today, there are policies that deal with them. Health misinformation, again, same thing. Now we've got a lot more in the way of policies dealing with it. This doesn't mean that it's solved the problem, because in a lot of cases, like we've got the horse has left the barn, right? And these communities of people are formed and the demand is there, but at least there's no new recruiting, if you will. But now we're at the areas where the lines are much less clear. And this is where you start to get at questions of what should be done about QAnon. And Facebook made the determination last year to remove all of the groups related to QAnon from the platform. And they did it under the Dangerous Orgs team, was the team that made that determination and took them down. And the interesting challenge that faces us now is when you try to dismantle groups that have been cohesive for a very long time, they usually migrate and they go somewhere else, more underground perhaps, into more encrypted spaces today. So the question becomes, is the trade-off of that dynamic, the creation of the perception that a viewpoint is being censored, and the pushing of these people into less visible spaces, is that worth it, so to speak, in the cost-benefit of analysis of not facilitating additional recruiting or not making it as easy to organize? And that is that's kind of where the front line in the question about platforming, deplatforming, and censorship is today, is how should platforms be thinking about that going forward?
Where do you fall on that?
It's really tough. I mean, my personal preference, so again, for audiences who are not as immersed in how moderation policy works, there are three rough buckets of moderation. There's what's remove, which is what we've been talking about, the idea that you take them down, you remove them from the platform, kill the account, there's reduce, which is what I was describing with, you remove it from the recommendation engine, you throttle its distribution, you make it harder to find. And then there's the last piece, which is inform. And inform is where you put up an interstitial or a fact check.
I'm wondering though, do you have any data on the success of the inform approach, of those little flags that let people know?
That's where I don't think we have very great data yet. There are some studies related to fact checking that there's been Brendan Nyhan's work on the backfire effect, but then he himself has said that he feels that some of the way in which that finding was processed kind of overstated it, created the perception that the backfire effect says that even just alluding to the conspiracy in the fact check reinforces it. People are, I think, moving away from that a little bit now, and so there is more of an opportunity to study these things. I think we're going to hit the point where, now that the inform function was used so widely during the election, we actually do now have a data set that is somewhat within the platforms, but they, Facebook and others are trying to do a little bit more to help outside researchers like us at SIO and other places do more studies using this data. So there's the potential to, one of the real concerns is how do you protect privacy while enabling this kind of research. And so I think there will be some data sets that will likely be made available to researchers who go through an application process to get it and look at it and try to answer exactly that question. What did this do during the election? Did people click on the inform link? Was there a decline in shares? When the interstitial was put up, if you have to click through to see a video, do people still click through? So I think
feel
that
I was gonna say, I feel like my intuition would make me think that it would work somewhat, right? Because I feel like a lot of the power of what we're talking about here is that you're really like hijacking people's social insecurities. And if you were about to share something that, was labeled with this could be a lie, I think it would make people pause a little bit before they reposted that and, had this thought in the back of the mind of like, maybe I'm sharing something that I'm telling people I'm sharing information that might be a lie. Maybe this would look bad on me in terms of somebody with integrity or something like that. And maybe it would slow things down, at least the people on the fringe.
I think it'll be right, the kind of the undecideds. I think it'll be interesting to see also to segment that by, is this information about health or something that is demonstrably false versus political sharing, where there's so much of a signaling function that goes into political sharing, right? Where you're really just saying like, I'm on this team. There have been people where, some of these videos have come out heavily edited. The one of Nancy Pelosi where they slowed it down, made it look like she was drunk. I don't know if you remember this. No.
I feel like I'm going to look it up now.
I know this is the thing. Like, I feel like I spend all my time looking at wild BS that,
You're like the perfect Redditor, really, at this point.
I really am way too online, but there was a video that went viral of Nancy Pelosi, and they had slowed it down to make her look like she was slurring her speech, and it went out as like drunk Nancy or something like that. And you do see when people will ask like, why did you share that video? Sometimes you'll see news coverage of it. Sometimes you'll just see people on Twitter asking, and they'll say like, well, because I hate her. It doesn't matter if it's true. I just hate her. So here you go. I shared it. And so that I'm curious to see if there's like differences in dynamics between what you're saying, not wanting to be the person who shares factually inaccurate, like pandemic information versus whether that consideration, that commitment to facts, how that intersects with political identity and sort of political tribalism.
Or just the allure of being somebody who's kind of doing something off the mainstream. Like people love that idea that I had right there. My intuition might be totally counterbalanced by the fact that people love the bad boys. They love the things that are just like maybe not acceptable, but I like that because it makes me unique. Go ahead.
There's a really interesting dynamic where on the Russia stuff, people track down some of the folks who the Russians were actually DMing with, because they were in the DMs, like trying to get people to hire a Hillary Clinton impersonator for a protest and put her on a flatbed truck in a jail. That was one of the things that happened, right? And so they're DMing people to try to interfere in these protest movements and create these big spectacles. They're offering Black Lives Matter activists like, can we send you money for posters? Like, how can we help your protest? And so they were doing this for all the different, issues and sides and groups that they had interfaced with. And as some of these posts as some of this information came to light and became public, there was an interview done with a woman who first her response was like, no, there's no way they were Russian, right? Which is fair, honestly. I mean, the disbelief response, like hearing that this even happened, seemed like a kind of a wild claim. And then as she, as you see the kind of realization hit, they're sort of showing her the citations from DOJ saying this happened. But then a lot of the attitude turns into like, well, who cares if it was the Russians? Like the Russians are amplifying a point of view that I already agree with. So who cares if it was the Russians or, and so again, it was really seen as like, well, it doesn't matter who the speaker is as long as I agree with the message. And so that's kind of an interesting dynamic as well, which is.
Yeah. Real quickly, what was the scale of the Russian infrastructure? You talked about earlier that it kind of collapsed and that slowed them down, but how many people are we thinking were actually involved in this coordinated effort?
So interestingly, our understanding of how the troll factory operates, I think it's got a couple thousand people, of whom a few hundred are, tasked on the America desk, if you will. The America desk was like the highest order, you were the best. You had fluent English, you were good at making your memes, et cetera, et cetera. Because the Internet Research Agency was operating globally. They're running operations in Ukraine also. And so, so they've got different, it's like a marketing agency, different focuses. The question of impact is a really interesting one. So it takes years to build up plausible accounts and personas. It's a very long game. And one of the things that we see is Russia consistently puts in the effort to create accounts, constantly creating accounts and building up their credibility until they're put to use for the operation that they're needed for, versus China, where we see state-sponsored, state-attributed information operations talking about the Hong Kong protests, talking about the Taiwan election, about COVID, about Chinese dissidents that they don't like. They do really flimsy, just garbage personas. Like, they don't invest the multiple years in building up that persona over time. So what you'll see is a lot of times the accounts are relatively new, and it's like Sarah 1248678, right? It's versus the Russian personas, where they have there's a biography, there's a character there, they live their character. It's much more of like an agent of influence model, because this is a persona, right? This is the same way that you would have a person in alias serving in another country, during the Cold War. You're effectively replicating that model of persona creation and the relationship building that goes into it, right? These personas, they're not just supposed to be broadcasters. They're supposed to form relationships with people, to look like them, speak like them, act like them, and that dynamic takes a much longer period of time. So to make sure I answered your question, though, with Russia, it was the accounts that they were using in 2016 and 2018 were created back in 2014, 2015. So it's a much more long game. So they have reconstituted other accounts. We do see newer accounts that are, again, technically linked to Russian state-linked actors, but they don't have the infrastructure of that entire. They weren't really trying to hide their stuff. That's the thing. In the old days, the accounts that came down were, once you had half the network, you could get the rest of the network. So.
And this is going to be an impossible question, I'm sure, because if you could figure this out, you would be probably the most popular person in the world right now. But in a perfect world, what is your solution going forward to this kind of stuff? What would you love to see happen that you think would assuage some of the issues, or at least increase the integrity or efficacy of the system?
Yeah, I stopped talking about solutions, which made me slightly unpopular for this question. But that's because I actually started thinking about it more as how do you manage a chronic condition, right? If you think about it as something for which there is no cure, but you can still live quite well, assuming you get the condition, down to a manageable degree of control. So I don't think that you are ever going to kick off every manipulator on the internet, or every foreign troll, or every domestic, domestic folks who run manipulation campaigns too. I think where we are is I'd like to see more thoughtful product design within tech platforms. We're starting to see more red teaming, where they're thinking through, when we release this feature, how will it be abused? Not will it be abused, how will it be abused? And so I always think that kind of work is actually it's it's like security research, right? The same idea that you're going to have someone pen test your networks or think through all of the ways that you have security vulnerabilities. I think that we can be doing that a little bit in the information space as well. When we add new affordances, how does the new affordance change the state of play across the internet ecosystem for those who wish to manipulate it? We can think about that proactively as opposed to releasing it and then throwing up our hands and saying like, who could have thought, I like the idea of friction, the injection of friction into the information ecosystem. And I think this possibly is also an unpopular point of view, but to defend it, what I will say is I think that the problem is not necessarily content a lot of the time. It's not the message, it's the inclination, it's the virality. It's that these things, again, the idea that you can throttle a video and slap an inform link on it is something that allows us to inject a little bit of friction. That's at the moderation level, but even at the user level, you may notice that Twitter has a thing now where it pops up a little message saying like, do you want to read the article, right? If you just hit the retweet button before you've actually clicked through and read the article, it gives you this little nudge. Do you want to read the article? And I think we'll have some interesting data into what that experiment shows. Does that reduce do people actually go and click through and read it at that point? So there are ways to incorporate friction in to slow the speed of information a bit in the hopes of increasing its accuracy. And I think that is an experiment I would like to see conducted. I think it's a very, tools like that, not being able to share until you've read or getting this prompt to share before you've read are potentially interesting. Making you recopy the URL is potentially interesting. Just things like that. And I think that's, and then the last thing I think is really curation. I think that the problem of finite attention means that there is this constant need to create sensational headlines, to do things that capture attention. And right now, the platforms generally rely on engagement as the determinant for what they're going to show you first, what they're going to rank at the top of your feed. And I think that there are opportunities to rethink how we curate information, to create perhaps a healthier information environment that uses other things besides is this the highest engagement content to decide what we see. I think putting some control in the hands of users there would also be very helpful for people to be able to have a little bit more control over what they're seeing, or at least to understand why this post was surfaced. So that's the kind of three things that I think are, can lead us towards a better information environment without over-promising on this belief that it's going to, fix something.
Yeah, I love your acceptance of the battle that we're in here. And I don't think those are unpopular opinions. I think those are great ideas. I mean, I really do like it. I wasn't being facetious. I think it's great that it's owning the fact that this is like the human condition, and this is something we're in a lot of ways, and this is just something that we're going to have to learn how to respond to.
Well, I really spent a lot of time, my limited free time. I'm actually most interested in like old propaganda books, old books on what did this look like then and what did we do about it, and are there, as we think through this as the next iteration as opposed to as a brand new problem, what are the ways in which the technological affordances have made it different, potentially worse, and how can we rethink those specific affordances as opposed to operating in this misguided belief that we're going to remove all false information or all propaganda from the internet, which we will not. So
yeah, I'll save the Edward Bernays conversation for another time.
Yeah.
I want to get one more question real quick from you and then let you go, because I know we're running pretty long here. But this is one's kind of for me. Do you support the idea of like a digital ID online at all?
That is such, I talk about this a lot with Balaji, actually. I am really intrigued by it. I would have to say, yes, I do. Not as a mandatory thing, but as a, what the blue check is supposed to be, in a sense, like the, or what it originally was before it became a marker of this is an impressive person you should pay attention to, but when it was really just like, this is who this person says they are, right? That idea of this is who the person says they are, I think is a really fascinating idea. I think that the idea that we don't need homogeneity across the internet. There are going to be platforms that allow for varying degrees of who you are. I remember hearing Moot speak back in the day where he was like, it's not who you share with, it's who you share as. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, that there are certain spaces that where you share differently because it's a different facet of your personality or identity. And I think that one of the things I really like about Reddit is this idea of persistent pseudonymity, where it's not like a throwaway alias where you recreate one and, because people can see if you're a brand new person, you have that 0 there, and it actually throttles you, right? You can't just go post. And I think that that makes sense. It facilitates good communication, and it facilitates better community that's not overrun with spammers and trolls and garbage accounts. So I think that was a good policy. And I think that persistent pseudonymity is also a really interesting idea, because it at least suggests that there's a kind of the same person, behind the scenes attached to that identity. I think that there will be certain spaces where people will gravitate to when they want to know that they're engaging with real people. And I think that this is going to become more important as we have generative AI. And what I mean by that is, as AI begins to generate text, there is the potential for more kind of harder to find. It'll be a lot harder to detect these types of things, because there won't be that repetitiveness or that combinatoric repetition of phrases that you can see when you look at these campaigns today. And it creates an interesting environment where there can be just sort of low-key, constant chatter produced by machines that creates the perception that a lot of people think or feel a certain way. There'll be a lot more of these types of things generated. And so the idea that you can participate in a space where you know that you're engaging with real humans, I think becomes a lot more important in the next 5 years, maybe. And I do think that there is something to be said for having a marker that that you are real. And I don't think doing it as a mandatory thing is where we want to be, but I do think that that creating that infrastructure is very valuable going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I love that idea of it being not mandatory, but I feel like if you had that option, you could see a space be created where you could expect more honest conversation, because if people would be held accountable for their ideas. Um, to close out, I just want to give you the chance then to tell us about anything you'd like to share with the audience. Is there anything you're working on? New research? I know you just did the pandemic stuff. Anything at all?
Yeah, we are putting out our election 2020 report. It is so long, but it's in chapters, so you don't have to read it all. It's looking at the narratives that shaped election 2020, beginning about 2 to 3 months before and going up through January 6th. And so it gets into the narratives themselves, so an understanding of what hashtags and other things were kind of moving the conversation. It goes into the dynamics by which they're shared, so people who want to understand how information hopped in very specific ways, like how a meme went viral. We kind of walk through some specific interesting case studies on things like Stop the Steal, and it kind of takes people up through. And then it also layers on for the techies how the policy shapes propagation. So how tech platforms are actually changing their policy to respond to kind of new and innovative challenges that emerged during election 2020. So it's really interesting stuff, and it'll be at io.stanford.edu.
Wonderful. We'll include that in the show notes, and that's going to be a publicly available report.
Yep.
Fantastic. Renee, I want to thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I feel like so informative. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's great to chat.